Welcome. I'm Glenn Anderson with the Olympia Fellowship of Reconciliation. This TV series explores a variety of issues that relate to peace, social justice, and nonviolent social change. Fish don't even have the concept of water. They spend their whole lives immersed in water, and it's all they know. We experience something like that in this country as the United States is a military superpower. Since about 1990, we've been the world's only military superpower. And so we often just don't recognize what that really means. The military reality and the United States' self-image that we're not only number one militarily, but that we also deserve to be number one in a lot of other ways too, combine into something that the rest of the world is very much aware of and the rest of the world often finds very frightening. Conflict is a normal part of human life. Conflicts can be either handled well or handled poorly. They can be handled through conversation and negotiation, or they can be handled through brute force and violence. During this hour, we have two guests who will help us understand and explore how the United States handles conflicts with other parts of the world. We have two guests. I'm happy to welcome Zahid Shariff and Bert Sachs. I respect both of them and have known them for some years. They're both people who have great knowledge and great wisdom and great compassion. So I'm happy to welcome Zahid and Bert here. Zahid Shariff has a strong background in understanding public policy and colonialism. He teaches at the Evergreen State College. Bert Sachs has a professional background in engineering. He's widely respected not only in this region, but really around the world for his courageous work, especially focusing on Iraq. So good to have both of you here.
Thank you.
Let's start by looking at the scope of just how much is the United States oriented toward military spending, the scope of our militarism. Can you tell us something about the scope of military spending?
Thank you, Glenn, first of all, for organizing this discussion. It's topical and vital. Just to give you an impression of how vast our military spending is, just last year's military budget consisted of items for the Department of Defense. Add to that Iraq and Afghanistan spending,
which are really not part of the official budget.
No, and you do need to add those things to come up with the total spending.
Right.
And then you add to that the amount spent on military construction and nuclear weapons development, which are also not part of the Department of Defense budget for some strange reason. And to that you add pensions and the disability payments for our veterans. And that comes to more than $670 billion.
Yeah, billion with a B.
That's right.
Yeah, which is almost $2 billion a day.
Yeah. One
almost.
could talk about this at great length, but I understand you have some charts about this.
Yeah, I want to show people, I know you can't read the text from here, but you can at least see the visual impact. The top left chart right here, these are old data. The relationships are still holding true, but these graphs were made in the about 1993 or 94 with data there, and if anything, it's only worse since then. The one on the top left here shows U.S. military spending compared to the nations that supposedly threaten us. The little dinky thing next to the tall black bar is Cuba, then Libya, Syria, Iraq. This was during the Saddam Hussein era, but after the first Gulf War, and then Iran and North Korea. So those are all strung out at the bottom here. You can see that the United States spending just overwhelms all of those. The second one, the graph on this side of the top row, looks at United States military spending versus other major forces. So the very, very tall one, again, is United States. Then there's Japan, France, the United Kingdom, Germany, Russia, Italy, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, South Korea, and Taiwan. And all those are very tiny compared to the U.S. we have another graph here that also you won't read the text for, but you'll see the visual. This is more recent data. This is the year 2000, fiscal year 2000. And the tall graph, again, the tall bar graph, shows U.S. military spending at this time close to 400 billion. And then the next tallest bar graph is all of our allies combined. And then the next one, much smaller, is Russia. The next one smaller than that is China. And then the last little tiny one off the side is all of the so-called rogue nations combined. Now this was 2000 fiscal year data, but again, the relationship is just so compelling. And we've been escalating, the United States has been escalating our military spending significantly since then.
I think it's also important to notice a particular divide in American history. And the Second World War, I think, is the point of division. And from the founding of the country until the Second World War, there was always a trend in a particular direction. That is, after each war, and the United States has been involved in many wars before Second World War, there was a demobilization after each war. And the military spending and the forces went back approximately to the same level as before the mobilization took place. But that dramatically changed after Second World War. And it's not surprising that General Eisenhower, who knew this as a general and was prescient enough to see the future, that he issued that famous warning about the military-industrial complex.
Yeah, and that was in January of '61, just as he was leaving office, and it really took off after that. We also have a lot of bases in other countries, military bases. Can you tell us something about that?
Right. Let me just complete the previous thought. After Second World War, even though the Second World War ended, to the great satisfaction of the United States, the Allied forces did come out victorious. The demobilization, unlike the past, did not happen. The Cold War started, and Korean War, and so on and so forth. Yeah. For a variety of reasons that Eisenhower did notice, did take hold, and military spending kept going up and up and up.
And even after the Soviet Union collapsed and we had no major rival, it dipped a little bit, but it's taken off and run up again.
Exactly.
So tell us something about military bases in other countries.
So the officially acknowledged bases are more than 773, and they are in more than 130 countries. Now, this is an underestimate because three bases in Qatar, from which the Iraq war was being launched, they're not included in this number of 773. And there are other bases on which less than $10 million is spent. That is the cutoff point. If less than that is spent, then those are not included either.
Chump change.
Right. Yeah. And so they're listening devices and other monitoring stations, and they're not included in this number either. So that is the extent of the expansive kind of presence, military presence the United States has at this time.
So how does this massive militarization affect U.S. culture? What happens to us then?
Well, I think it promotes certain kinds of values, values of manliness. The word war is used in a variety of settings, war on drugs, the idea of issuing directives in ways which assert authority as opposed to participatory norms. We see that in Hollywood. More and more violence is being shown. Male bonding, hierarchy, honor, these values are being coming to the surface more and more. Other values are being reduced.
When we were preparing for the program, you suggested that we might check with Bert to see about what happens to the dehumanization of people in the front line.
Right.
And I wonder, is that something?
Sure. I think it's obvious that people who are soldiers in this kind of a war and who are there on the front line see things that impacts them terribly. And we have a notion of post-traumatic stress disorder. We'll have fearfully thousands and thousands of American soldiers who are going to come back who have seen suffering either that they've caused or different factions in Iraq have caused among each other. And they come back, and it's evidence to my mind of a fundamental part of our nature that wants to empathize with other human beings. And you see children, you see women, you see even other enemy soldiers, and you naturally will have some identification and empathy with them as other human beings. And you see their terrible suffering, you come back, you end up disturbed, distraught, whereas if you look at the people who commit their lives to trying to help other people, like the Dalai Lama, like Mother Teresa, those people aren't suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder. They seem to be happy human beings. I think that's a piece of evidence about our nature, and one of the real consequences of war, along with all of the other reasons why war should not be entered into the way we have.
I'm also, as you talk about that, I'm thinking of this quotation from Martin Luther King during the Vietnam era, when he realized that in order to pay for the war, we were having to cut the anti-poverty programs at home, the domestic programs that would actually be helping people in order to pay for a war that was killing people. And he said that the bombs that we're dropping on Vietnam are really exploding at home. You know, it's just, we're destroying our cities, we're destroying our own people by doing the war. It's,
General Eisenhower said something very similar to that
Yeah.
in his final statement to the country, I believe.
Right, yeah, something about how when we spend on armaments, we're hanging people on a cross of iron. I don't know if that's a different quotation of the same.
I don't think that's
Ike,
Ike, but
no, it was.
Was it?
Yeah, yeah. I don't have it in my notes, but it's in my head, but not exactly word for word. But he talks about the weapons represents the
I remember
sweats and tears and.
in the final analysis, every dollar spent on weapons is actually taken away from, and not just the dollars, but the creativity of our scientists and our engineers, taken away from the uses that we need to feed people, to give people better health.
Yeah. So how does all this massive spending, how well does that work? How well are we solving international problems by using this massively military approach?
Well, there are three ways of obtaining foreign policy objectives. One is through war, and the other two are diplomacy, and the third one is economic policy. And the United States, I think, unlike any other country, relies on war and military much more than the other two. And the consequences are all around us. It also leads, emphasis on war also leads to something that Chalmers Johnson calls the blowback effect.
Yeah.
And that is, for instance, the stationing of bases abroad are a constant provocation to the host countries.
Yeah.
And the blowback effect comes back in ways that we have not predicted, and comes as a surprise to Americans here. But I think Johnson is right in saying that this is a thorn in the side of most people, because the effects, we don't think about the social effects of, I think, good American boys and young women there, but they are not culturally attuned to the people they're going to be living with. And they're very young, and they act in ways the way they would act here, but over there, they have very serious consequences.
And we'll talk some more about blowback some more in the program. I'm also thinking in terms of the effectiveness of this, that we're spending like $300 billion plus a year with nuclear weapons and all that stuff, and it had no deterrent effect on 19 guys with some box cutters, or however many, 15 guys, 19, whatever it was, a few guys with box cutters on September 11. So we've been putting out this 300 plus billion a year, and couldn't really protect our country. I mean, it's like this disproportionate thing where it just wasn't working, and so seems like a $300 billion a year extortion scheme for the military-industrial complex.
Well, before the program, I learned from Zahid that the phrase blowback, as described by Chalmers Johnson, actually was a CIA term that came to apply to the negative consequences of an action we took in 1953 to overthrow the democratically elected leader of Iran, Mohammad Mossadegh. Mm-hmm. And we put the Shah into place. And it took 25 years, more or less, but in reaction to the Shah and our coup, which is well known in Iran and Iraq and throughout the Middle East, there was the Iranian Revolution, the fundamentalist revolution that put the mullahs and the Islamic fundamentalists into power, and the hostage-taking that we know about in 1978, 79. I wanted to make a point. Not only did that create blowback in the sense of much reasonable anger, understandable anger in the entire Muslim world, but on top of that, the reason we did it was essentially we wanted control of Iranian oil. It's well understood. Mm-hmm. That's why the CIA sent Kermit Roosevelt to do this and to manage the coup.
Back in '53,
well, yeah. Whether you do it by waging war or a CIA coup or even sanctions or even diplomatic pressure, there's a fundamental question we need to ask. Do we have a right to want to pursue these objectives when, if we simply ask the question, how would we feel if somebody said they're going to apply even economic pressure or diplomatic pressure to get our resources? That's a basic question. The nature of the world's direction right now is putting in our face, in the sense that we're running out of oil, we're running into global climate change, and we're waging wars for the sake of controlling the oil, and we can't keep going this way.
If I may add something to what Bert has said, it's an excellent point. Stephen Kinzer has written a book on the 1953 coup called All the Shah's Men, in which he makes the point that, although he doesn't use the word blowback for it, he says that the origins of Muslim terrorism can be traced back to exactly that year, 1953. Hezbollah came from that. Not directly, here's what happened. 1953, the Shah of Iran is planted in power. Then that leads to a reaction, forceful reaction. Ayatollah Khomeini takes his place, and that leads to the embittered memories of that coup, and from that comes Hezbollah. And now we don't know what to do with it.
There's a familiar saying that says, what goes around comes around. It just, we keep doing, on the, you're knowledgeable about Israeli realities, and the United States relies on heavy violence and warfare and stuff. How is Israel doing by relying on heavy militarism and violence?
Israel is an example, almost a model, of why militarism, long term, even medium term, isn't going to work. And Israel is there in this enclave. There are 6 million Israelis, let's say, more or less, and it's surrounded by a sea of 100 million Arabs and 1 billion Muslims, 1 billion plus. In that situation, the idea that given two factors, that the weapons are becoming increasingly destructive, and now anyone with a Google map can find the coordinates of Tel Aviv and Haifa, and their mortars and rockets, and we've seen Hezbollah with their rockets being able to reach Haifa. What's going to happen in just one generation or 2 generations? No matter what military superiority Israel has with all the weapons, the $30 billion we're sending them now in recent aid, for anyone concerned about Israel, it's pretty clear that Israel has to make peace and come to accommodation with the Palestinians living in the occupied territories within Israel and with its neighbors. And they were offered that actually by Saudi Arabia, and an arrangement where if they would withdraw and there would be a Palestinian state. Instead, what Israel's doing is occupying the occupied territories, building settlements there, destroying the possibility of accommodation, and thinking they can keep doing this because they have the most powerful military in the area. Well, what's happening with our occupation of Iraq and our belief that our $500 billion military can take over and control this small, relatively small country? You see what's happening. Because the weaponry is increasingly destructive, and because the communication is so rapid around the world that the Roman Empire could go in and take a revolting part of the Roman Empire and simply kill everybody. But you can't do that, and you don't want to do that. And that's putting an end to, I believe, empire per se, and the use of the military to try and drive empire.
Yeah. It really seems like a very dinosaur kind of philosophy. This notion that we can do that is really obsolete. The world won't put up with it. I mean, you had mentioned when we talked on the phone to prepare for the show that in terms of colonialism, which we'll talk about in a few minutes, people just don't put up with that anymore. But I want to show something about the Iraq. Before the current war started in March of 2003, I devised what I called the Iraq War Science Project, and just used basic laws of physics. And I showed this actually on this TV program around that time. But I also showed it to staff at Congressman Brian Baird's office. I showed this to Mike Oakland, the editorial page editor of the Olympian newspaper, and showed this to some other audiences. And basically, we have this notion that there's this pyramid of nations in the world. And there's this pyramid with their bottom tier of poor nations and a upper tier of more well-to-do nations, and the United States sits alone on top of the pyramid. We're number one. America's number one. And we know that what happens with war, and then there are other like rogue nations that aren't part of our system. North Korea and Iraq and before the war, and Iran and other, quote, rogue nations that are not part of our hierarchy. And we know that what happens with war is war just launches all kinds of unpredictable results. And so when you have a war, it's like randomness and chaos kick in. And so I said before the war started in March 2003, I said, if Bush does go ahead with that war, there will be unintended consequences. He thinks war is kind of like shaking the table. Bush was thinking that he can shake this table of war and the cans will jiggle and all these rogue nations will come in as a new bottom tier of countries that'll be part of our hierarchy and that we'll still be on top. But the laws of physics don't indicate that, as this science fair project shows. But you could actually, if you were to shake the table, which I won't do, the cans would tumble. And this top country, the United States, will no longer be on top if Bush does his war. And that was the point of this. And I think in the 4+ years, 4.5 years now since he did that, I think that's proved to be true. That he did this war, chaos and all kinds of unexpected consequences arose, and the United States really is no longer on top of the world. The fiction still exists, but I think the empire is crumbling, and the whole world knows it.
Let me interject another notion here, and that is we're talking as though rational decision-making was at work. We want certain outcomes, and if we did thus and so, this would happen. But I think what's happening here is that there are not necessarily nations, but there are certain interests that are involved. I think those interests do not necessarily desire particular solutions. They desire that those interests be furthered. And so if the convulsions continue, if peace does not prevail, if turmoil increases, chaos reigns, that's good.
For some people,
yeah,
and for their interests.
And those interests, armament industry, and then that's not, I think that's a very narrow definition of what Eisenhower talked about. To that should be added a variety of think tanks. A large number of universities now depend on defense contracts for their research. There are a huge number of neighborhoods and congressmen that depend on that to get elections. I came across, while reading for this program, of something that escaped my attention. Our own senators, both the senators from Washington State, insisted that some $40 billion be added to the defense budget, which the Department of Defense had not requested,
right,
because Boeing should be encouraged
Yeah.
because the jobs are here.
Yeah.
So you see, this, what I'm trying to say is that peace is something that you would think that all
Yeah.
good people, rational people would want to desire. But the war mongering, that's maybe seems too harsh, but they are now a constituency for war, which is so widespread.
Yeah.
And so many people that are seemingly good people and probably our neighbors and friends who thrive on it. Their careers and futures depend on it.
Right.
Yes.
Beyond the dynamics that lead to war, beyond just the foreign policy aspects, when we were talking on the phone to prepare for the show, you're referring to violence and punishment as models. And I wonder if you could say something about, there's a Dr. James Gilligan that you've done some study on the prison system. Tell us something of that.
This is a very interesting man, graduate of Harvard, psychiatrist, could have a very comfortable, easy practice in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Didn't do that. He went into the Massachusetts prison system. He's become, for 25 years, somebody who has become the head of the psychiatric section responsible for the Massachusetts prison system. And when asked why, he said, well, that's where the violence is. That's what I want to understand.
It's the same as you mentioned the Willie Sutton quote. Somebody
That's
asked decades ago, the famous bank robber Willie Sutton, why do you rob banks? And he said, that's where the money is. And so that was Gilligan's response about violence.
So this is the third of his books I've read. It's called Preventing Violence. And here's the quote. And this is from his 25 years in the Massachusetts prison system. He says, the most powerful stimulus to violent behavior that we have yet discovered is punishment. Now, think, and he makes the clear point, this is true not just within the Massachusetts prison system. It's a general principle, so that when you punish an individual or you punish a whole nation, you can expect that that's going to provoke violence. And look at the world today. Whether you look at punishing the Iraqi people with 12 years of sanctions in which 500,000 of their children have died, or today punishing the Palestinians in Gaza by cutting off their electricity and denying them aid and help with the notion that you can starve a people into submission. That's a quote from Senator Craig from Idaho, talking about the sanctions, but it's true today, or what we're talking about doing with Iran. If you intend to punish a people, or even going back in history, punishing the whole German people at the end of World War I,
Right.
and humiliating people, which he makes the point of, this has serious implications for trying to understand if we want to deal with violence and reduce violence, that what we have put into place is arguably the most powerful mechanism for increasing violence. And look at the violence in the United States of America compared to the other industrialized countries. One other thing I want to say that he says about violence is another systemic cause of violence, the thing that correlates very well country by country or community by community, is the greater the disparity of wealth within an area, the greater the level of violence. And we have 5 to 10 times more violence in our country than the other industrialized countries, and 5 to 10 times greater incarceration rate. We punish people more. And it's a very good book because it challenges the prevailing notions of what causes violence and what's going to solve it.
Yeah, we have a terrible rate of recidivism. If people get out of prison and then they do something and they end up back in there again, and people think, well, we need harsher sentences. We need to punish them more. And the real problem is that we're not rehabilitating. It's the punishment itself that does it. And you look at drug use, how we criminalize that in this country. Other countries will treat this as a public health issue, which is a whole different model.
I'm sure we'll get to, I hope we'll get to the question of what would it take for us to change our view of people that do bad things? And how do we have to change the view from they're good guys and bad guys into what kind of a view where we aren't naive, we don't ignore the situation in the world today, whether in our communities or the world, and yet we change our model.
Yeah, we will get into that, I hope. I want to look at one other aspect of where conflicts happen and how the militarism option is just really not even considered as off the table, which is good. I worked a few decades for the state government, for a state agency, and sometimes our state agency would disagree with another state agency about what to do in a given situation. And I kept thinking at a staff meeting what I should do is say, well, let's get a bunch of guns and we'll go over there and beat the crap out of those people and start shooting and killing them until they see things the way our agency wants things done. And of course that would have been preposterous, and they probably would have hauled me out of there dragged me out of the staff meeting for saying that. We know that that's not how you handle a conflict between one state agency and another state agency. But nations, that's how we do it at the foreign policy level. And we're just so used to doing this. Send out the Marines, drop some bombs. But we know at a community level where we see each other as people that that's not how to do it. But at the foreign policy level, that's just the default. Anyway, I just wanted to toss that out there. We talked about blowback a little bit, and you have some quotations related to electricity that you can share. I'll hold up a quotation, and we're going to be tight on time, so if you can maybe read it pretty rapidly, okay. And I'll hold one people can follow along.
This is sort of a quiz of sorts for your viewers. The first quotation you can think in your mind where they might have come from and what they're talking about. The quote goes, "In some cases, Mr. Zahid and other Iraqi officials say, insurgents cut power to the capital as part of their effort to topple the government."
Okay.
I'll give you the source in just a minute and the date.
Yeah.
Here's the second one. Quote, "The lack of electrical power in Iraq now has led to acute malnutrition and epidemic levels of cholera and typhoid. At least 170,000 children under 5 years of age will die." Quote, "Big picture, we wanted to let people know, get rid of this guy and we'll be more than happy to assist in rebuilding. We're not going to tolerate his regime. Fix that and we'll fix your electricity." First quote is from the New York Times August 23rd front page story talking about Mr. Zahid, the Minister of Electricity in Iraq, talking about insurgents using power, cutting power, to topple the government.
That's October 23rd of 2007.
Yes, this year, okay? The second quote comes from June 23rd, 1991. So less than 6 months after the first Gulf War, where we bombed 96% of Iraq's electrical generating capacity. We did it, this was a Pentagon bombing planner being quoted, we did it to get rid of this guy, meaning Saddam Hussein, to topple the government of Iraq, and we're not going to let people have water or sewage processing by destroying their electricity. And that was our strategy, to cut power to topple a government. Where did the insurgents learn it? They learned it from us.
Yeah, it's exactly the same strategy. Topple the government of Iraq by destroying their electrical capacity. Very interesting. So,
and blowback is, I think what we're seeing is blowback from that policy over 12 years.
That's exactly what that is. I can imagine that there will be blowback from the war on terror. It's very clear that blowback occurred not only after the United States overthrew Iran's government in 1953, but also blowback on September 11 of 2001 in this country, from other policies that we've been doing over the years. It's just very clear. The Bush administration is whipping up fear of Iran and seems to want to make war on Iran as like the next step in this churning of a pattern. And it's like we don't learn from mistakes, but like you said, maybe it serves some people's interest if that's, if it's oil and if it's armaments and so forth. But I remember when the Shah was still in power, this horrible dictator that Amnesty International had said, this was back in the 70s, when the Shah, our dictator, was in power in Iran, Amnesty International said that Iran had the world's worst human rights record. It was like far and away, and that was our ally in the region. Nixon and Kissinger were propping him up as the Kissinger doctrine of having a powerful dictator in different places that could control that region. And the United States was selling our best weapons, and the United States Senate Armed Services Committee had a subcommittee looking into what was going on with U.S. weapon sales to Iran, and they described U.S. weapons program for Iran as out of control. Now, out of control is a quote from the report from the U.S. Senate Armed Services Committee subcommittee working on this. That's not a radical peacenik organization by any means. And so that's what was going on with Iran, and we were pumping money into that dictator's military. When the coup happened in 1979, which the students in Iran really did largely nonviolently, they refused any longer to put up with the Shah, and there were U.S.-made Bell helicopters. Bell was the manufacturer, U.S. was the supplier, but we had sold them to the Iranian Air Force, and they were swooping down through the streets of Tehran, machine gunning people and killing, innocent, unarmed people. And those people in Iran, they knew who had provided those helicopters. They knew who was killing their people. And so it's that cycle which then, resulted in the taking of the U.S. hostages. And I mean, this cycle just goes and goes and goes, and we got to break that chain. It's just frustrating. And here Bush is off and ready to do this again. Just keep the thing spinning. Let's see, we're running late. I wonder, can you say something about colonialism and neocolonialism and empire, something of that cluster?
I think there was a human consciousness doesn't remain constant. It changes over time. And there was a time, particularly 19th century, which was a period of colonialism. Colonial powers acted in that fashion, colonized people accepted them, by and large. But I think now time has come when it is no longer accepted. It's just that kind of a situation where one country can go make war on another, conquer another, invade, occupy, and then either continue to rule it or hand over power to a friendly government. That kind of a colonial operation neither has the support, I think, in many of the Western powers within the country, and it certainly has lost all the justification it had in the minds of the people who were being colonized. And that is now, I think that's a strange kind of a paradox for the United States. On one hand, it has huge, almost unlimited military power to do whatever it can want to do. But on the other hand, the world consciousness has changed. Mm-hmm. And this view is not a left of center view. It is also the mainstream view now in the United States. Mm-hmm. To give you an example of this, Zbigniew Brzezinski, in his book, says the same thing. Mm. No, I can't think of any more mainstream figure as Brzezinski. Yeah. The period of colonialism is really gone. Uh-huh. And if we can't think of a better strategy, this strategy is going to fail. And with it will go not only, I look at the pictures of the young men who get killed, and I'm just deeply saddened. 19, 20-year-old young men and women who've got whole lives ahead of them cut short. Mm-hmm. For what? Mm-hmm. Yeah. This is, I think, a strange, very sad situation.
Yeah, it really is a very dinosaur-like foreign policy. It's just, there's a common notion sort of in the public at large, at a usually a not very well thought through level, but some people think it through in some detail about the just war. People say that, well, war might be regrettable, but sometimes it's necessary in sort of an informal common sense kind of decision. And then there are people who actually have articulated just war criteria that actually go back for hundreds of years. And I've read the criteria as they've been formulated in various ways. And the theory is that to be just, a war has to meet all of these criteria. And if you look at what's going on in the wars nowadays, we're just not meeting any of these criteria about proportionality and ends and means and sparing civilians. And is there anything you could add to that sense? We're running short on time, but I want to just attach.
I think one of the changes that's happened in the world, which is a good one, is we've come to recognize, especially at the end of World War II, that we can't simply allow any country that has the military power to go and do what it wants and invade any other country. And so we were one of the prime powers behind the Nuremberg trials and developing the Nuremberg principles and creating the United Nations as an institution to put an end to the scourge of war. With regard to war, we said there are only two conditions internationally that can make a war legitimate, legal. And they are, one, if you are being attacked or in imminent danger of attack, you're allowed to defend yourself. Imminent danger of attack or you're being attacked. And then only until you have time to go to the United Nations. And the other condition is the United Nations then will consider your case and either authorize, as it did in '91, or not authorize, as it did in 2003, the war. And if it doesn't authorize the war, it is by definition an illegal war.
Right, and that's what we're in.
And the condition that Americans have to consider is, right now, we say if Congress votes to go to war, any country, to attack any country, anywhere in the world, any time, if Congress votes for that, it's, we say, a legal war. But that's in flagrant violation of the principles that we help create. And we have to recognize that international law ought to rein us in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and our Constitution says that the treaties that we do, and by extension international law, are the supreme law of the land. And it's not enough for us to say, oh yeah, but Congress said so that trumps it. No, it doesn't.
Well, unfortunately, and I'm quite sure this is correct, and it's a very common misunderstanding, treaties are described as the highest law of the land in the Constitution. In the same article, Article 6, I think it is, any other law that Congress passes is an equally high law of the land, meaning that whatever law, whether a treaty or another just regular law passed by Congress, whichever one comes subsequent in time is the one that governs. And so if Congress decides to authorize torture, even though we signed the Torture Convention, if we want to violate the Geneva Convention, if we just pass another law within our domestic legal system, that is what governs constitutionally. And it's only the notion of international preemptory norms, which are called technically jus cogens, that needs to rein in and say to any country in the world, there are certain crimes, certain actions you may not commit, and they include initiating a war of aggression. They include war crimes. They include genocide. And no matter what you do domestically, and whatever your Constitution says, you may not do that because it's become such a standard of international behavior and so abhorrent.
Well, we have to recognize that what's sauce for the goose is sauce for the gander. If the United States says, well, yeah, but we can do this anyway, well, that means that Rwanda can have a law doing something, or Paraguay, or you name it. Russia or China or anybody can do anything. So, I mean, that's where international law comes in, and the UN and stuff. That we have to have civilized ways to do it, or else it's just.
So I'd just like to make the point
Yeah.
that I believe we're under an attack on the rule of law. And we can see that domestically, challenges to impeach the president and the vice president for violations of the Constitution. But internationally, it's also a question of the rule of law.
Yeah. Can you tell us something about this notion of U.S. exceptionalism?
Sure.
Kind of briefly, because we're tight.
It says we can do what we prohibit other nations from doing because we're the United States.
Yeah.
And we don't apply the principle, the golden rule. We don't say, would we accept this from other nations? It's a mistake.
Yeah. Let me see what. We got some notes here now. Tell us about sanctions, the Iraqi economic sanctions, and the genocidal aspect of it.
Yeah, I think there's another
it's
important
crucial.
point.
Go ahead.
That Zahid said that there are other options for getting what we want besides war. But it's important to recognize that in the 12 years of economic sanctions after we had destroyed Iraq's infrastructure.
And these economic sanctions prohibited them from doing business with the rest of the world, importing cloth, medicine, books, whatever. I mean, a lot of stuff. And it really clamped down extremely tightly, as you know.
I mean, we had the New England Journal of Medicine telling us clearly that 5,860 children were dying every month from January to August of '91, the period that they studied. That's 195 kids every day were dying, principally from epidemics of waterborne disease. We knew it. We were told by one of our premier medical journals, and we continued that policy for year after year. First, we said to overthrow Saddam, but that's terrorism.
And again, the diseases were caused because we had destroyed their electricity system, their water system, their sewage system.
Yeah.
And so we essentially, during the first Gulf War, the United States used a form of biological weapons in that it was, you know, the bugs in sewage and stuff.
There are quotes from the Washington Post that same date, June 23rd, 1991, where the Pentagon bombing planner said, a pretty close quote from the Pentagon bombing planner. He said, people said we didn't know about water and sewage. Of course we did. Yeah. When you take out electricity, you can't pump water, you can't process sewage. What were we doing with the sanctions? Helping the Iraqi people? No, what we were doing was accelerating the effect of the sanctions. And Colonel John Warden, the architect of that war, the air war, said it gives us, quote, long-term leverage. Now, that is waging war on a civilian population and killing many more children. You can't imagine that we could bomb a kindergarten and kill 195 children day after day and continue that. We'd be seen as barbarians. That's the Seattle Times. And yet we could do it by economic means. So part of the message that I think we need to learn is economic pressure can be even more deadly than military pressure. And we have to open our eyes and empathize with the human beings that are there in the rest of the world, because if we don't, we are creating enemies and anger towards us and hatred that will come back in all different kind of forms.
And yet part of the way these foreign policies are allowed to continue is that we have mindsets where we don't think of these as they really are. We have euphemisms. So we think of national security or national defense, or this is just defense, or we have notion like the military protects our freedom, and we ignore all the cases where they're taking away innocent people's lives. We have such blinders on that it gets us into a lot of trouble because we're not looking at the reality. And I wanted to check back on one other thing here. We had talked about compassion. The word compassion came up earlier in the program. And I want us to look at what values we actually do have and play with what values would you like to see reflected in our foreign policy, if not values about domination and greed and violence to get our way at all costs. What values would you like? And we really are getting tight on time, but I know compassion comes into this.
Well, I think that any number of ways the United States has, but I will make it very specific. United States government quite often says that we are not against Muslims, we are only against terrorists. But Muslims see it quite often differently, or many Muslims do, I can't speak for all of them. In all the international conflicts where Muslims are involved, the United States government is either neutral or it's against them. So what are Muslims to think about it? So if the United States wants to be viewed differently, one thing it could do is to not position itself in those international conflicts in the way it is positioning itself at this moment. That's one off the cuff suggestion. Other thing is that fashioning its policies that rely more on things that help people, as opposed to those that don't. For instance, the whole loans to poor countries and IMF policies that are based on them are hurting people a lot.
Because it's disrupting their local economy, their local food growers and things,
Yeah.
and other kinds of things. See, we got just 5 minutes left. I want to see if we can squeeze in. Let's talk something about how we proceed. If we want to have a foreign policy that's based on more compassion, we need to be able to cultivate compassion. You've suggested some good ways to proceed when we were talking on the phone. Can you say something on this? Because we have really like 5 minutes or so left.
Sure.
Total.
I've gone on a bit about Iraq and the sanctions, and we've also spoken about Mohammed Mossadegh and the CIA coup. Those are things which I would say perhaps 5% of Americans know about. We are basically blind to things that our country has done out there. And overthrowing the democratic leader of a country, pursuing a policy that's contributed to the deaths, at least, of hundreds of thousands of children, destroying infrastructure as a means of doing it. Those are things we don't know. There are two quotes that just came my way about now things we're not aware of in the inner life that we have, things that I think underlie a policy of going to war, thinking that's a legitimate solution, thinking you don't need to be concerned about other people. So again, as a sort of test for your listeners, let me read these two quotes.
Okay, and I'll hold up a copy they can see.
And ask people to imagine who might have said them. And I think you might be surprised. Okay, the first quote is this: "I speak not with a feeling of anger or hatred towards those who are responsible for the immense suffering of our people and the destruction of our land, homes, and culture. They too are human beings who struggle to find happiness and deserve our compassion." End quote. Second quote: "I call on you not to hate, because hate does not leave space for a person to be fair, and it makes you blind and closes all doors of thinking," said the letter, which the AP translated. Quote, "I also call on you not to hate the people of the other countries that attacked us." Okay? The first quote is from the Dalai Lama in his Nobel Peace Prize lecture when he received the Nobel Peace Prize. And of course, the country he's talking about most particularly is Tibet and the occupation of Tibet by the Chinese. The second quote, it may surprise you, is the last statement from Saddam Hussein, translated from Arabic by the Associated Press in a statement to his fellow countrymen just before he was hanged. Okay? Now, the reason I think these are interesting is because they both talk about a principle that we in our country need to pay attention to, which is when you cultivate hatred, and it's true not just in the military or on one side of the political spectrum, but equally in the peace movement. When you cultivate hatred towards our leaders or towards anyone, what you're doing is blinding yourself, making yourself suffering, and being counterproductive, I think, if you wish to create peace. And it's a real challenge I would offer for your listeners to think about what, perhaps I'll give you the last word on this, what in Islam and other religions speak of this as well, is called the inner jihad.
Yeah,
If we have time.
about 20 seconds for inner jihad.
Inner jihad means the internal struggle that each Muslim is expected to engage in, and that is seek guidance from God about issues that all human beings face. For instance, the questions might be, Lord, how can you help me overcome temptation? Lord, help me make a decision about my family. That's the kinds of issues that jihad is supposed to be about.
Right.
Overcome anger.
Overcome anger, temptation, hatred. The only exception to that is a very remote one, and that is when Muslims were being used as a human shield by another group that was attacking Muslims. And in that rare case, Muslims consulted with each other and said what to do. If we don't attack now, this army is going to take over our town. In that case, they said, these are unarmed Muslims, but in this case, in the name of jihad, we can attack them.
Yeah.
But that exception is sometimes misused to say you can launch jihad against unarmed people. But that's the only exception. Unarmed people cannot be subjected under jihad.
Yeah.
Except for that, this one remote exception.
Yeah. Okay, great. Thanks for all the great, wise, and compassionate things you've been saying. Thank you for being here as guests on the show. As I said at the beginning, fish don't have a concept of water. They're just immersed in it, and that's all they know. That really is our experience as Americans in terms of the foreign policy that relies so much on violence and militarism. We assume that we have a right to be number one, that we have a right to boss other people around, go anywhere in the world, do anything we want. And there's that old saying that says you have to fight fire with fire, but that's wrong. You fight fire with water. And we have to recognize that military violence does not work. It would be fun to create a foreign policy based on compassion. We're all one human family. We all share one planet. We can create a better world, but we all have to work on it. And the world needs what you have to offer. Thanks for watching.